I'm Eddie Chumney of Hebraic Heritage Ministries, and we welcome you to this week's Focus Israel Report. In this week's report, we're going to share with you regarding the current situation with the peace process. Specifically, we're going to share with you the contents of a letter that was written by Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas to be given to the Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu, which outlines the Palestinian position in the peace process in their plans going forward. In addition, we're going to be sharing with you regarding the current situation with Syria. First, an overview of the peace process. It is as follows. On April the 17th, Palestinian officials delivered a letter from Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, blaming Israel for the failure of the peace talks. The Palestinians will only agree to direct negotiations with Israel if Israel quits building Jewish homes in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem and agrees to release Palestinian prisoners arrested prior to the 1994 Oslo Accords. The Palestinians will give Israel 1 month to agree to these demands. If Israel doesn't agree to these Palestinian demands, the Palestinians have threatened to renew their efforts for recognition of a Palestinian state at the United Nations through the United Nations General Assembly, and they are specifying that they would begin this effort in either May or June. Israel said that they will reply to the letter that they have been given by the Palestinians, asking for the Palestinians to enter into direct negotiations. And these direct negotiations would be between Mahmoud Abbas and Benjamin Netanyahu. And Israel is requesting that these talks be held without preconditions and that the Palestinians recognize Israel as a Jewish state and the security concerns of Israel would be addressed. The Palestinians have already stated that they will reject Netanyahu's offer for direct negotiations. As it relates to the Palestinians going back to the United Nations for recognition of a Palestinian state, the United States has said that they will veto a further Palestinian request at the UN Security Council for recognition of a Palestinian state. So next, I want to read to you the actual letter that was sent by the Palestinians to Israel, and it reads as follows. Dear Prime Minister Netanyahu, in 1993, the Palestinian Liberation Organization signed the Declaration of Principles, or the Oslo Accords, and exchanged letters of mutual recognition with the government of Israel. The Declaration of Principles defined its aim as the implementation of UN Security Council Resolutions 242 and 338, which would begin with the transitional period and culminate with negotiations on all final status issues, including Jerusalem, borders, settlements, refugees, water, security, and relations with neighboring countries, and other matters of mutual interest. Over the years, we included end of the conflict and claims, and the release of prisoners and detainees to these final status issues. May 1999 was set as the date by which negotiations on all final status issues would be completed and a comprehensive peace agreement between the two sides would be reached. The PLO and the State of Israel subsequently signed additional agreements, including the Interim Agreement in 1995, the Y River Agreement in 1998, the Hebron Protocol of 1998, and the Sharm Sheikh Agreement in 1999. We also engaged in negotiations on final status issues during the Camp David talks in 2000, the Annapolis talks between 2007 and 2008, in talks conducted in Washington, D.C., Sharm el-Sheikh, and West Jerusalem in September of 2010. Most recently, in January 2012, I dispatched a delegation to Amman, Jordan for exploratory talks in furtherance of the Quartet statement of the 23rd of September 2011. In the midst of these agreements and bilateral talks, the Arab states presented the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, and the Quartet for Middle East Peace presented its Roadmap Plan of 2003. Signed agreements, international law, and UN resolutions all recognize that peace will only be realized upon the end of Israel's occupation of Palestinian land that began in 1967. Until such time, Article 7 of the Interim Agreement stipulated that both parties, Israel and the PLO, shall not take any steps that would prejudice final status negotiations. A fundamental obligation placed on Israel under international law in the Quartet's roadmap was that it freeze all settlement activity, including natural growth. In a letter sent by former Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres to Norwegian Foreign Minister Holtz in 1993, Israel also committed itself to maintain the educational, economic, social, and cultural institutions in East Jerusalem, conserve the Christian and Muslim holy places, preserve Palestinian interests in East Jerusalem, and not to hinder their development. Mr. Prime Minister, as leaders, both of us have to face skepticism and opposition. In the quest of peace, we have to help each other. We know that violence and terror, whether committed by Palestinians or Israelis, is not the way. I know that it erodes both of our public's trust and peace. Therefore, I reiterate our full commitment to a policy of zero tolerance against violence. At the same token, I expect your understanding that settlement building is eroding the Palestinian trust in your commitment to reconciliation and the idea of the two-state solution. The logic is simple. If you support the establishment of a Palestinian state, why do you build on its territory? Mr. Prime Minister, among the most critical components of the signed agreements between the Palestinians and Israel is the recognition that the West Bank and the Gaza Strip constitute a single territorial unit, the integrity of which must be preserved until a final status agreement is reached. As such, it is subject to one law and one authority. In recognition of this, I have been determined to end the division of my people through national reconciliation in accordance with my political program, which respects signed agreements, recognizes the State of Israel, and renounces violence. With regret, the government of Israel has chosen to take a position diametrically opposed to Palestinian national reconciliation. Aside from this, we continue to honor all of our obligations, including the reactivation of the Trilateral Anti-Incitement Committee. Mr. Prime Minister, we have responded in good faith to the efforts exerted by President Obama and the Quartet in furtherance of peace, and we have welcomed the courageous Jordanian initiative aimed at putting the peace process on the right track, including through the submission of comprehensive positions on territory and security by the parties. The Palestinian delegation submitted our proposals on these two final status issues, and we have reiterated our commitments and obligations. We ask your government to also submit comprehensive proposals on territory security and to commit to a settlement freeze and release prisoners. These were not preconditions but Israeli obligations. To our deep regret, none of these commitments were honored. Mr. Prime Minister, our historic peace proposal is still waiting for an answer from Israel. We agreed to establish the State of Palestine on only 22% of the territory of historical Palestine, on all the Palestinian territory occupied by Israel in 1967. The establishment of an independent Palestinian state that can live side by side with the State of Israel in peace and security on the borders of 1967 with mutually agreed swaps equal in size and value. Security will be guaranteed by a third party accepted by both to be deployed on the Palestinian side. a just and agreed resolution for the refugee problem as specified in the Arab Peace Initiative. Jerusalem will serve as a capital of two states: East Jerusalem, capital of Palestine; West Jerusalem, capital of Israel. Jerusalem, as an open city, can be a symbol of peace. Mr. Prime Minister, 20 years ago, we concluded with Israel an agreement under international auspices which was intended to take the Palestinian people from occupation to independence. Now, as a result of actions taken by successive Israeli governments, the Palestinian National Authority no longer has any authority and no meaningful jurisdiction in the political, economic, social, territorial, and security spheres. In other words, the Palestinian Authority lost its reason for existence. In recognition of the above and in furtherance of the peace process in the agreements we signed with Israel, which were premised on international legitimacy, international law, and international recognized terms of reference, we call on the government of Israel to do the following. Number 1. Accept the two-state solution on the 67 borders with possible minor and mutually agreed upon land swaps of equal size and value. Number 2. Stop all settlement activities, including in East Jerusalem. Number 3. Release all prisoners, in particular those imprisoned prior to the end of 1994. And number 4. Revoke all decisions taken since 2000 which undermine agreements signed between Israel and the PLO. Should the government of Israel refuse to honor these above referenced obligations, we will seek the full and complete implementation of international law as it pertains to the powers and responsibilities of Israel as occupying power in all of the occupied Palestinian territory. For the Palestinian Authority, now stripped of all meaningful authority, cannot continue to honor agreements while Israel refuses to even acknowledge its commitments. The Palestinian Authority is no longer, as was agreed in this situation, cannot continue. Mr. Prime Minister, I strongly believe that both our peoples yearn for peace. As leaders, it's our historic task to make it happen. Let's not fail our peoples. Sincerely yours, Mahmoud Abbas, Chairman of the PLO Executive Committee, President of the Palestinian National Authority. And so Israel has said that in the next week or so it will respond to this letter. As it relates to the Palestinians saying that they plan to go back to the United Nations to get recognition of a Palestinian state, the next article from the Jerusalem Post, April the 16th, the headline says, "The United States will veto any Palestinian statehood bid at the United Nations." The United States will continue to act against Palestinian attempts to gain recognition through the United Nations, and if necessary, will use its veto to that end, U.S. Ambassador to Israel Daniel Shapiro said Monday. Speaking at the Netanya Academic College, Shapiro said that there are no shortcuts to peace in the Middle East, and the Palestinians must return to direct negotiations with Israel without preconditions, on the basis of what was outlined by U.S. President Barack Obama. Next, we will give you an outline regarding the current situation with Syria. Russia continues to support the Syrian government of Bashar Assad against the opposition who is trying to overthrow him. Russia said that Western and Arab support of the opposition is hurting the chances for ending the bloodshed in Syria. Russia has decided to permanently deploy warships off the Syrian coast to protect Assad from external military intervention. However, Saudi Arabia and Turkey are discussing plans to attack Syria to overthrow Assad if the peace plan of Kofi Annan fails. Well, that concludes this week's update where we shared with you regarding the current situation with the peace process as well as the current situation with Syria. Until we do it again, Shalom. In Yeshua the Messiah. Amen.